The Dead Sexton by Sheridan Le Fanu. The sunsets were red, the nights were long, and the weather pleasantly frosty, and Christmas, the glorious herald of the new year, was at hand, when an event, still recounted by winter firesides, with a horror made delightful by the mellowing influence of years, occurred in the beautiful little town of Golden Friars, and signalized as the scene of its catastrophe the old inn known throughout a wide region of the Northumbrian counties as the George and Dragon. Toby Crook, the sexton, was lying dead in the old coach-house in the inn yard. The body had been discovered only half an hour before this story begins, under strange circumstances, and in a place where it might have lain the better part of a week undisturbed, and a dreadful suspicion astounded the village of Golden Friars. A wintry sunset was glaring through a gorge of the western mountains, turning into fire the twigs of the leafless elms and all the tiny blades of grass on the green by which the quaint little town is surrounded. It is built of light grey stone, with steep gables and slender chimneys rising with airy lightness from the level sward by the margin of the beautiful lake, and backed by the grand amphitheatre of the fells at the other side, whose snowy peaks show faintly against the sky, tinged with the vaporous red of the western light. As you descend towards the margin of the lake and see Golden Friars, its tapered chimneys and slender gables, its curious inn and gorgeous sign, and over all the graceful tower and spire of the ancient church, at this hour, or by moonlight, in the solemn grandeur and stillness of the natural scenery that surrounds it, it stands before you like a fairy town. Toby Crook, the lank sexton, now 50 or upwards, had passed an hour or two with some village cronies over a solemn pot of purl in the kitchen of that cosy hostelry the night before. He generally turned in there about 7 o'clock and heard the news. This contented him, for he talked little and always looked surly. Many things are now raked up and talked about over him. In early youth he had been a bit of a scamp. He broke his indentures and ran away from his master, the tanner of Brymere. He had got into 50 bad scrapes and out again, and just as the little world of Golden Friars had come to the conclusion that it would perhaps be well for all parties, except perhaps himself, and a happy riddance for his afflicted mother, if he was sunk with a gross of quart pots around his neck in the bottom of the lake, in which the grey gables, the elms, and the towering fells of Golden Friars are mirrored, he suddenly returned, a reformed man at the ripe age of 40. For 12 years he had disappeared, and no one knew what had become of him. Then, suddenly, as I say, he reappeared at Golden Friars, a very black and silent man, sedate and orderly. His mother was dead and buried, but the prodigal son was received good-naturedly. The good vicar, Dr. Jenner, reported to his wife, "His hard heart has been softened, dear Dolly. I saw him dry his eyes, poor fellow, at the sermon yesterday." "I don't wonder, Hugh, darling. I know the part. There is joy in heaven. I'm sure it was, wasn't it? It was quite beautiful. I almost cried myself." And the vicar laughed gently and stooped over her chair and kissed her and patted her cheek fondly. "You think too well of your old man's sermons," he said. "I preach, you see, Dolly, very much to the poor. If they understand me, I am pretty sure everyone else must. And I think that my simple style goes more home to both feelings and conscience." "You ought to have told me of his crying before. You are so eloquent," exclaimed Dolly Jenner. "No one preaches like my man. I have never heard such sermons." Not many, we may be sure, for the good lady had not heard more than 6 from any other divine for the last 20 years. The personages of Golden Friars talked Toby Crook over on his return. Dr. Lincoat said, "He must have had a hard life. He had dried in so, and he's got a good deal of hard muscle. I rather fancy he's been soldiering, you know. Well, he stands like a soldier, and that mark over his right eye looks like a gunshot." People might wonder how he could have survived a gunshot over the eye. But was Dr. Lincoat not a doctor? And an army doctor to boot, when he was young? And who in Golden Friars could dispute with him on points of surgery? Honest Mr. Turnbull, the host of the George and Dragon, said heartily, "We must look out for something for him to put his hand to now the time's come to make a man of him." The end of it was that he became, among other things, the sexton of Golden Friars. He was a punctual sexton. He meddled with no other person's business, but he was a silent man, and by no means popular. He was reserved in company, and he used to walk alone by the shore of the lake, while other fellows played at fives or skittles, and when he visited the kitchen of the George, he had his liquor to himself, and in the midst of general talk he was a saturnine listener. There was something sinister in this man's face, and when things went wrong with him, he could look dangerous enough. There were whispered stories in Golden Friars about Toby Crook. Nobody could say how they got there. Nothing is more mysterious than the spread of a rumour. It is like a vial poured on the air. It travels like an epidemic on the sightless currents of the atmosphere, or by the laws of a telluric influence equally intangible. These stories treated, though darkly, of the long period of his absence from his native village, but they took no well-defined shape, and no one could refer them to any authentic source. On the evening before the tragedy came to light, trifles are always remembered after the catastrophe, a boy, returning along the margin of the mere, passed him by, seated on the trunk of a fallen tree, counting silver money. His lean body and limbs were bent together, his knees were up to his chin, and his long fingers were telling the coins over hurriedly in the hollow of his other hand. He glanced at the boy, as the old English saying is, like the devil looking over Lincoln. But a black and sour look came from Mr. Crook, who never had a smile for a child, nor a greeting for a wayfarer, so that was nothing strange. Toby Crook lived in the grey stone house, cold and narrow, that stands near the church porch with its windows looking out into the churchyard, where so much of his labour for many a day had been expended. The greater part of the house was untenanted. The old woman, who was in charge of it, slept in a little settle-bed, among broken stools, old sacks, rotten chests, and other rattle-traps, in the small room at the rear of the house, floored with tiles. At what time of night she could not tell, she awoke, and saw a man with his hat on in her room. He had a candle in his hand, which he shaded with his coat from her eyes. His back was towards her, and he was rummaging in the drawer in which she usually kept her money. Having got her quarter's pension of £2 that day, however, she had placed it, folded in a rag, in the corner of her tea-caddy, and locked it up in the eat malison, or cupboard. She was frightened when she saw the figure in her room, so, sitting bolt upright in her bed, and, in a fit of creepings, as she expressed later, she demanded, "In God's name, what do you want?" "Where's the peppermint you used to have here, woman? I'm bad with an inward pain." "It's all gone a month sin," she answered, and offered to make him a hot drink if he'd leave her room and go back to his own. But he said, "Never mind, I'll try a mouthful of gin." And turning on his heel, he left her. And in the morning, the sexton was gone. Not only in his lodging was there no account of him, but when inquiry began to be extended, nowhere in the village of Golden Friars could he be found. Still, he might have gone off on business of his own, to some distant village before the town was stirring, and the sexton had no kindred to trouble their heads about him. People, therefore, were willing to wait, and take his return ultimately for granted. At 3 o'clock, the good vicar, standing at his hall door, looking across the lake toward the noble fells that rise steep and furrowed from that beautiful mere, saw 2 men approaching across the green in a straight line from a boat that was moored at the water's edge. They were carrying between them something which, though not very large, seemed ponderous. "You have a look at this, sir," said one of the boatmen, as they sat down almost at his feet. A small church bell, such as in old-fashioned chimes yield the treble notes. "I think it must be from the church steeple there, sir," said the other man. "What? One of our church bells?" ejaculated the vicar, for a moment lost in horrible amazement. "Oh, no, no, that can't possibly be. Where did you find it?" He had found it in the boat, in the morning, which was floating about 50 yards from her moorings where he had left it the night before, and he could not think how that came to pass. And now, as he and his partner were about to take their oars, they discovered this bell at the bottom of the boat, under a bit of canvas. Also, the sexton's pick and spade. "Very extraordinary. We must try whether there is a bell missing from the tower," said the vicar, getting into a fuss. "Has Crook come back yet? Does anybody know where he is?" The sexton had not yet turned up. "That's odd. That's provoking," said the vicar. "However, my key will let us in. Place the bell in the hall while I get it, and then we can see what all this means." To the church, accordingly, they went, the vicar leading the way with his own key in his hand. He turned it in the lock and stood in the shadow of the ground porch and opened the door. A sack, half full, lay on the ground, with open mouth, a piece of cord lying beside it. Something clanked within it, as one of the men shoved it aside with his clumsy shoe. The vicar opened the church door and peeped in. The dusky glow from the western sky, entering through a narrow window, illuminated the shafts and arches, the old oak carvings, and the discoloured monuments, with the melancholy glare of a dying fire. The vicar withdrew his head and closed the door. The gloom of the porch was deeper than ever as, stooping, he entered the narrow door that opened at the foot of the winding stair that leads to the first loft, from which a rude ladder-stair of wood, some 25 feet in height, mounts through a trapdoor to the ringer's loft. Up the narrow stairs the vicar climbed, followed by his attendants, to the first loft. It was very dark, A narrow bow-slit in the thick wall admitted the only light they had to guide them. The ivy leaves, seen from the deep shadow, flashed and flickered redly, and the sparrows twittered among them. "Will one of you be so good as to go up and count the bells to see if they are all right?" said the vicar. "There should be—" "Hey, up! What's that?" exclaimed one of the men, recoiling from the foot of the ladder. "By God!" ejaculated the other in equal surprise. "Good gracious!" gasped the vicar, who, seeing indistinctly a dark mass lying on the floor, had stooped to examine it and placed his hand upon a cold, dead face. The men drew the body into the streak of light that traversed the floor. It was the corpse of Toby Crook. There was a frightful scar across his forehead. The alarm was given. Dr. Lincoat and Mr. Jarlcott and Turnbull of the George and Dragon were on the spot immediately, and many curious and horrified spectators of minor importance. The first thing ascertained was that the man must have been many hours dead. The next was that his skull was fractured across the forehead by an awful blow. The next was that his neck was broken. His hat was found on the floor, where he had probably laid it, with his handkerchief in it. The mystery now began to clear a little, for a bell, one of the chime hung in the tower, was found where it had rolled to, against the wall, with blood and hair on the rim of it, which corresponded with the grisly fracture across the front of his head. The sack that lay in the vestibule was examined, and found to contain all the church plate, a silver salver that had disappeared about a month before from Dr. Lincoat's store of valuables, the vicar's gold pencil case which he thought he had forgot in the vestry book, silver spoons, and various other contributions levied from time to time off a dozen different households, the mysterious disappearance of which spoils had, of late years, begun to make the honest little community uncomfortable. 2 bells had been taken down from the chime, and now the shrewd part of the assemblage, putting things together, began to comprehend the nefarious plans of the sexton, who lay mangled and dead on the floor of the tower, where only 2 days ago he had tolled the holy bell to call the good Christians of Golden Friars to worship. The body was carried into the yard of the George and Dragon, and laid in the old coach-house, and townsfolk came grouping in to have a peep at the corpse, and stood around, looking darkly and talking as low as if they were in a church. The vicar, in gaiters and slightly shovel hat, stood erect as one in a little circle of notables. The doctor, the attorney, Sir Geoffrey Mardykes, who happened to be in the town, and Turnbull, the host, in the centre of the paved yard, they having made an inspection of the body, at which troops of the village stragglers, toing and froing, were gaping and frowning as they whispered their horrible conjectures. "What do you think of that?" said Tom Scales, the old hostler of the George, looking pale, with a stern, faint smile on his lips, as he and Dick Lincoln sauntered out of the coach-house together. "Well, the devil will have his own," answered Dick in his friend's ear. The gentlefolk, who were talking the matter over in the centre of the yard, had dispatched a message for the coroner to come all the way from the town of Hexton. The last tint of sunset was fading from the sky by this time, so of course there was no thought of an inquest earlier than the next day. In the meantime, it was horribly clear that the sexton had intended to rob the church of its plate, and had lost his life in the attempt to carry the second bell, as we have seen, down the worn ladder of the tower. He had tumbled backwards and broken his neck upon the floor of the loft, and the heavy bell in its fall descended with its edge across his forehead. Never was a man more completely killed by a double catastrophe in a moment. The bells and the contents of the sack, it was surmised, he meant to have conveyed across the lake that night, and with the help of his spade and pick to have buried them in Clousted Forest, and returned, after an absence of but a few hours, as he easily might, before morning, unmissed and unobserved. He would, no doubt, having secured his booty, have made such arrangements as would have made it appear that the church had been broken into. He would, of course, have taken all measures to divert suspicion from himself, and have watched a suitable opportunity to repossess himself of the buried treasure and dispose of it in safety. And now came out into sharp relief all the stories that had one way or other stolen after him into the town. Old Mrs. Pullen fainted when she saw him, and told Dr. Lincoat after that she thought he was the highwayman who fired the shot that killed the coachman the night they were robbed on Hounslow Heath. There were stories also told by the wayfaring old soldier with a wooden leg, and 50 others up to this more than half disregarded, but which now seized upon the popular belief with a startling grasp. The fleeting night soon expired, and twilight was succeeded by the early night. The inn-yard gradually became quiet, and the dead sexton lay alone in the dark on his back, locked up in the old coach-house, the key of which was safe in the pocket of Tom Scales, the trusty old hostler of the George. It was about 8 o'clock, and the hostler, standing alone on the road in front of the open door of the George and Dragon, had just smoked his pipe out. A bright moon hung in the frosty sky. The fells rose from the opposite edge of the lake like phantom mountains. The air was stirless. Through the boughs and sprays of the leafless elms, no sigh or motion, however hushed, was audible. Not a ripple glimmered on the lake, which at one point only reflected the brilliant moon from its dark blue expanse like burnished steel. The road that runs by the inn door along the margin of the lake shone dazzlingly white. White as ghosts among the dark holly and juniper stood the tall piers of the vicar's gate, and their great stone balls like heads overlooking the same road a few hundred yards up the lake to the left. The early little town of Golden Friars was quiet by this time, except for the townsfolk who were now collected in the kitchen of the inn itself. No inhabitant was now outside his own threshold. Tom Scales was thinking of turning in. He was beginning to feel a little queer. He was thinking of the sexton, and could not get the fixed features of the dead man out of his head, when he heard the sharp, though distant ring of a horse's hoof upon the frozen road. Tom's instinct apprised him of the approach of a guest to the George and Dragon. His experienced ear told him that the horseman was approaching by the Dardale road. The hoofs were plainly coming at a gallop, with a hollow rattle. The horseman was a long time in appearing. Tom wondered how he had heard the sound, so sharply frosty as the air was, so very far away. He was right in his guess. The visitor was coming over the mountainous road from Dardale Moss, and he now saw a horseman who must have turned the corner of the vicar's house at the moment when his eye was wearied, for when he saw him for the first time, he was advancing in the hazy moonlight, like the shadow of a cavalier at a gallop upon the level strip of road that skirts the margin of the mere between the George and the vicar's piers. The hostler had not long to wonder why the rider pushed his beast at so furious a pace, and how he came to have heard him, as he now calculated at least 3 miles away. A very moment sufficed to bring the horse and rider to the inn door. It was a powerful black horse, something like the great Irish hunter that figured 100 years ago, and would carry 16 stone with ease across country. It would have made a grand charger. Not a hair turned. It snorted, it pawed, it arched its neck, and then threw back its ears and down its head, and looked ready to lash and then to rear, and seemed impatient to be off again, and incapable of standing quiet for a moment. The rider got down. But he was a tall, sinewy figure. He wore a cape or short mantle, a cocked hat, and a pair of jack-boots, such as held their ground in some primitive corners of England almost close to the last century. "Take him, lad," he said to old Scales. "You need not walk or wisp him. He never sweats or tires. Give him his oats, and let him take his time to eat them. House!" cried the stranger, in the old-fashioned form of summons, which still lingered at that time in the out-of-way places, in a deep and piercing voice. As Tom Scales led the horse away to the stables, it turned its head towards its master with a short neigh. "About your business, old gentleman. We must not go too fast." The stranger cried back to his horse, with a laugh as harsh and piercing as he strode into the house. The hostler led this horse into the inn-yard. In passing, it sidled up to the coach-house gate, within which lay the dead sexton, snorted, pawed, and lowered its head, suddenly with ear close to the plank, as if listening for a sound from within. Then uttered again the same short, piercing neigh. The hostler was chilled at this mysterious coquetry with the dead. He liked the brute less and less every minute. In the meantime its master had proceeded. "I'll go into the kitchen," he said to the drawer who met him in the passage. And he went on as if he had known the place all his days, not seeming to hurry himself, stepping leisurely, the servant thought, but gliding on at such a rate, nevertheless, that he had passed his guide, and was in the kitchen of the George before the drawer had even got so much as halfway there. A roaring of dry wood, peat, and coal lighted up this snug but spacious apartment, flashing on pots and pans, and dressers piled high with pewter plates and dishes, making the uncertain shadows of the long hanks of onions and many a flitch of ham, depending on the ceiling, dancing on its glowing surface. The doctor and the attorney, even Sir Geoffrey Mardykes, did not disdain on this occasion to take chairs and to smoke their pipes by the kitchen fire, where they were in the thick of the gossip and discussion excited by the terrible event. The tall stranger entered uninvited. He looked like a gaunt, athletic Spaniard of 40, burned half black in the sun, with a bony, flattened nose. A pair of fierce black eyes were just visible under the edge of his hat, and his mouth seemed divided beneath the moustache by the deep scar of a hare lip. Sir Geoffrey Mardykes and the host of the George, aided by the doctor and the attorney, were discussing and arranging, for the third or fourth time, their theories about the death and the probable plans of Toby Crook, when the stranger entered. The newcomer lifted his hat with a sort of smile for a moment from his black head. "What do you call this place, gentlemen?" asked the stranger. The town of Golden Friars, sir," answered the doctor politely. "The George and Dragon, sir. Anthony Turnbull, at your service," answered mine host with a solemn bow at the same moment, so that the two voices went together as if the doctor and the innkeeper were singing a catch. "The George and Dragon," repeated the horseman, expanding his long hands over the fire which he had approached. "St. George, King George, the Dragon, the Devil." It is a very grand idol, that outside your door, sir. You catch all sorts of worshippers, courtiers, fanatics, scamps, all fish, eh? Everybody welcome, provided he drinks like one. Suppose you brew a bowl or two of punch, I'll stand it. How many are we here? Count, and let us have enough. Gentlemen, I mean to spend the night here. My horse is in the stable. What holiday, fun, or fair has got so many pleasant faces together? When I last called here, for now I bethink me I have seen the place before, you all looked sad. It was on a Sunday, that dismalest of holidays, and it would have been positively melancholy only that your sexton, that saint here upon the earth, Mr. Crook, was here. He was looking round over his shoulder, and added, I don't see him there tonight. Frightened a good deal were some of the company. All gaped in the direction in which, with a nod, he turned his eyes. Mine host did not care that the George should earn the reputation of a haunted house. He's met an accident, sir. He's dead, he's elsewhere, and therefore can't be here. Upon this, the company entertained the stranger with a narrative which they made easy by a division of labour, 2 or 3 generally speaking at a time, and no one being permitted to finish a second sentence without finding himself corrected and supplanted. The man's in heaven, so sure as you're not, said the traveller, soon after the story was ended. What, was he fiddling with the church bell, and he died for that, eh? Landlord, get us some drink. The sexton has died for pulling down a church bell, the same bell he's been pulling at for 10 years. You came by the Dardale road, I believe, said the doctor. Village folk are curious. A dismal moss is Dardale Moss, sir, and a bleak climb up the fells on the other side. I say yes to all, from Dardale Moss as black as pitch, and as rotten as the grave, up that zigzag wall you call the road that looks like chalk in the moonlight, through Clough, as dark as a coal pit, and down here to the George and Dragon, where you have a roaring fire, wise men, good punch, here it is, and a corpse in your coach-house. Where the carcass is, there will be eagles gathered together. Come, landlord, ladle out your nectar. Drink, gentlemen, drink all. Brew another bowl by the bar. How divinely it stinks of alcohol. I hope you like it, gentlemen. It smells all over of spices, like a mummy. Drink, friends. Ladle, landlord. Drink all. Serve it out. The guest fumbled in his pocket, and produced 3 guineas, which he slipped into Turnbull's fat palm. Let punch flow till that's out. I'm an old friend of the house. I call here back and forward. I know you well, Turnbull, though you don't recognize me. You have the advantage of me, sir. You have the advantage of me, sir, said Mr. Turnbull, looking hard on that dark and sinister countenance, which, or the like of which, he could have sworn he had never seen before in his life. But he liked the weight and the colour of his guineas as he dropped them into his pocket. I hope you will find yourself comfortable while you stay. You have given me a bedroom? Oh, yes, sir, the cedar chamber. I know it, the very thing. No punch for me. By and by, perhaps. The talk went on, but the stranger had grown silent. He had seated himself on an oak bench by the fire, towards which he extended his feet and hands with seeming enjoyment, his cocked hat being, however, a little over his face. Gradually the company began to thin. Sir Geoffrey Mardyke's was the first to go, then some of the humbler townsfolk. The last bowl of punch was on its last legs. The stranger walked into the passage and said to the drawer, Fetch me a lantern, I must see my nag. Light it. That'll do. You need not come. The gaunt traveller took it from the man's hand and strode along the passage to the door of the stable yard, which he opened and went out. Tom Scales, standing on the pavement, was looking through the stable window at the horses when the stranger plucked at his shirt sleeve. With an inward shock, the hostler found himself alone, in the presence of the very person he had been thinking of. "I say, they tell me you have something to look at in there." The stranger pointed with his thumb at the old coach-house door. "Let us have a peep." Tom Scales happened at that moment to be in a state of mind highly favourable to anyone in search of a submissive instrument. He was in great perplexity and even perturbation. He suffered the stranger to lead him to the coach-house gate. "You must come in and hold the lantern," said he. "I'll pay you handsomely." The old hostler applied his key and removed the padlock. "What are you afraid of? Step in. Throw the light on his face," said the stranger. "Throw open the lantern and stand there. Stoop over him a little. He won't bite you. Steady, or you might pass the night with him." In the meantime, the company at the George had dispersed, and shortly after, Anthony Turnbull, who like a good landlord was always last in bed and first up in his house, was taking alone his last look around the kitchen before making his final visit to the stable yard, when Tom Scales tottered into the kitchen looking like death, his hair standing upright. He sat down on an oak chair, all of a tremble, wiped his forehead with his hand, and, instead of speaking, heaved a great sigh. It was not until he had swallowed a dram of brandy that he found his voice and said, "We've the devil himself in the house. By Jen, you'd best send for clergyman, sir." "Oh, you mean that black-faced fella with a broken nose? Why, that's a gentleman with a pocket full of guineas and a horse worth £50.
That horse is no better than his rider. Them nags that were in stable with him, they all took the creepings and sweated like rain. Had to shift them all out away from him. And then I felt somebody grab me shoulder, and it were him, the stranger. He comes from behind me. And then he says, "Take your candle, open that door, and let me look at the dead man's body." So I opens door for him, and as God is my judge, I seen the corpse open its eyes and start working its mouth, like he was striving to talk. I couldn't move or say a word. I felt my hair rising on my head. At long last I gave out a shout, and I said, "What's that? What are you doing? What's happening?" And he looked round at me like he were the devil, and he just laughed at me and knocked the lantern out of my hand. And when I came to, we were outside the coach house and the moon was shining, and I could see the corpse was stretched out on the table as we'd left it. And he kicked the door to, and he says, "Lock it." So I did. I said, here's the key, have it yourself." And he offered me money, and he said he'd make me a rich man if I would sell him the corpse and help him carry it away.
"Get away with you, man,"
said the landlord. "What would he want with the corpse? He's not a doctor. He was just taking the eyes out of you, lad." No, he wants that body. There's somewhat we can't understand that he wants to do with it."
"Where is he now?"
asked the landlord, who was growing uncomfortable. He sprang back up the stairs to his room. I wondered you didn't hear him tramping up there like a wild horse. You better get the vicar. Fetch the vicar and talk with him."
"Hoity-toity, man, you're too easily scared," said the landlord, though he was pale enough by this time.
"You're certain you locked the door on the corpse?"
"Aye, sir, certain."
"Come with me, Tom. We'll have our last look round the yard." So, side by side, with many a look left and right and over their shoulders, they went in silence. On entering the old-fashioned quadrangle surrounded by stables and other rooms, they stopped for a while, under the shadow of the inn gable, and looked around the yard and listened. All was silent, nothing stirring. The stable lantern was lighted, and with it in his hand, Tony Turnbull, holding Tom Scales by the shoulder, advanced. He hauled Tom after him for a step or two, then stood still and shoved him before him for a step or two more, and thus, cautiously, they approached the coach-house door. Whispered, "There, you see, all safe," whispered Tom, pointing to the lock which hung distinct in the moonlight in its place. "Come back, I say." "Come on, say I," retorted the landlord. "It would never do to allow any tricks to be played with the chap in there." He pointed to the coach-house door. "The coroner here in the morning and never a corpse to look at." He unlocked the padlock with these words, having handed the lantern to Tom. "Here, go on, get in, Tom," he said. "You have the lantern. Just go and see if all is as you left it." "Not me. Nah, not for the George and all that's in it," said Tom with a shudder. He took a step backward. "What are you afraid of? Oh, give me the lantern. I'll go." And cautiously, little by little, he opened the door, and, holding the lantern over his head in the narrow slit, he peeped in, frowning and pale, with one eye, as if he expected something to fly in his face. And he closed the door without speaking, and locked it again. "As safe as a thief in a mill," he whispered with a nod to his companion, and at that moment a harsh laugh overhead broke the silence startlingly, and set all the poultry in the yard a-gabbling. "There he be," said Tom, clutching the landlord's arm. "He's up in the window, see?" The window of the cedar room up 2 flights of stairs was open, and in the shadow a darker outline was visible of a man with his elbows on the window-stone looking down at them. "Look at his eyes, like 2 burning coals," gasped Tom. The landlord could not see very sharply, being confused and not as long-sighted as Tom. "Time, sir," called Tony Turnbull, turning cold as he thought he saw a pair of eyes shining down redly at him. "Time for honest folk to be in their beds, sir, and asleep." "As sound as your sexton," said the jeering voice from above. "Come out of it, come on," whispered the landlord fiercely to his hostler, plucking him hard by the sleeve. They went into the house and shut the door. "I wish we were shut of him," said the landlord with something like a groan, as he leaned against the wall of the passage. "I'll sit up anyhow, and Tom, you'll sit with me. Come into the gun room. None shall steal the dead man out of my yard when I can draw a trigger." The gun room in the George is 12 feet square and projects into the stable yard, commanding a full view of the old coach house. Tony Turnbull took down the blunderbuss, which was the great ordnance of the house, and loaded it with a stiff charge of pistol bullets. He put on a great coat which hung there, and covered his face when he went out at night to shoot wild ducks. The landlord laid the blunderbuss across his knees and stared into the yard. His comrade also stared. The door of the gun room was locked, so they felt tolerably secure. An hour passed. Nothing had occurred. Another passed. The clock struck 1. The shadows had shifted a little, but the moon shone full on the old coach-house and the stable where the guest's horse stood. Turnbull thought he heard a step on the back stair. Tom was watching the back door through the side window, with eyes glazing with the intensity of his stare. Anthony Turnbull, holding his breath, listened at the room door. It was a false alarm. When he came back to the window, looking into the yard, "Shh! Look at that!" he said in a vehement whisper. From the shadow at the left, they saw the figure of the gaunt horseman in short cloak and jack-boots emerge. He opened the stable door and led out his powerful black horse. He walked it across the front of the building till he reached the old coach-house door, and there, with its bridle on its neck, he left it standing, while he stalked to the yard gate, and dealing it a kick with his heel, it sprang back with a rebound, shaking from top to bottom, and stood open. The stranger returned to the side of his horse, and the door, which secured the corpse of the dead sexton, seemed to swing slowly open of its own accord, as he entered and returned with the corpse in his arms, and swung it across the shoulders of the horse, and instantly sprang into the saddle. "Fire!" shouted Tom, and bang went the gun with a stunning crack. 1,000 sparrows' wings winnowed through the air from the thick ivy. A dog yelled a furious bark. There was a strange ring and a whistle in the air. The blunderbuss had burst to shivers right down the very breech. The recoil rolled the innkeeper upon his back onto the floor, and Tom Scales was flung against the side of the recess of the window, which saved him from a tumble as violent. From this position they heard the searing laugh of the departing horseman, and saw him ride out of the gate with his ghastly burden. Perhaps some of my readers, like myself, have heard this story told by Roger Turnbull, now host of the George and Dragon, and grandson of the very Tony who features in the story. What infernal object was subserved by the possession of the dead villain's body I have not learned, but a curious story, in which a vampire resuscitation of Crook the Sexton figures, may throw light upon this part of the tale. The result of Turnbull's shot at the disappearing fiend certainly justifies old Andrew Morton's dictum, which is thus expressed in his curious History of Apparitions. "I warn rash brands who, pretending not to fear the devil, are for using the ordinary violences with him which affect one man from another, or with an apparition in which they may be sure to receive some mischief. I knew one who fired a gun at an apparition, and the gun burst into 100 pieces in his hand. Another who struck at an apparition with a sword, and broke his sword in pieces and wounded his hand grievously. And it is next to madness for anyone to go that way to work with any spirit, be it angel or devil."